Sorry, that wasn't nearly a minute, but it is now 1:30. So let's go ahead and get started. Welcome back from lunch. Hope everybody had a great lunch. Thanks so much for coming by this talk. Hey, can I borrow your shoes? Please be prepared to actually let me borrow your shoes, as is the title of the talk. I hope you all came in with that expectation. Today we're going to be talking about the theory and practice of empathy in video game narratives. And as a part of this conversation, we're going to be looking at some myths, some popular sayings, and some thinkings about what video games can do in the realm of empathy and interpersonal communication and understanding. And we're going to look at those myths and see what of those can be beneficial to us as designers, developers, and writers, and what of those can actually be very damaging for both ourselves and our creative process and our audience. So let's get started. That is the wrong computer. A little bit about me. My name's Josh Stead-Dorval. I'm a narrative and game designer with a background in academic research. I've worked on games and student projects through both the University of Rochester and Magic Spell Studios at the Rochester Institute of Technology. I'm a battle-hardened viola player, an aspiring pickleball champion, and if anybody who came to the last session knows, I am clinically insane about the Stanley Parable. So if anybody just wants to talk to me about the Stanley Parable afterwards, that is also more than fine. I'm here today for a couple of reasons. One, I love games. Fairly self-explanatory. Two, I want to tell stories that resonate deeply with audiences. That's always been my dream as a writer and a designer, to be able to connect with audiences on an emotional level, on maybe even a spiritual level, a mental kind of cognitive level, and really kind of impact and leave them with something to kind of think about and chew on. And ideally, I'd really like to make a difference with my games. We're going to kind of get into both the pros and the cons of that. And like I established earlier, I do need a new pair of shoes. So if anybody is willing to let me borrow their shoes, I'd be very grateful. I'm, of course, kidding, but there is a reason that I bring that up. Whatever feeling you just experienced when I said that, humor, confusion, most likely secondhand embarrassment, hold on to that feeling and think legitimately and think about it as we kind of go through and proceed with this talk, because we're going to be talking in a talk about empathy. We're going to be talking way more about shoes than you might realize. This picture is kind of the big final reason I'm here. This wonderful group of people is the first cohort of designers at Peaceland Studios. In the summer of 2024, last year, we came together to make the first demo of a game called Peaceland Choose Your Memory. This is a pro-social game about using memories to move towards peace in a post-conflict environment. If anybody was at NarraScope last year, a few of us came and did a talk about the game and how we were developing it. I came into this project right here with the attitude that we were building an empathy game, a game that would make players feel empathy for characters they otherwise wouldn't. And when the project ran into both successes and some difficulties last summer, I found myself more and more challenged by that mindset. I had taken it for granted that a video game can automatically, by its nature as a medium, inspire empathy in players more effectively than any other widely accessible form of fiction. And by the end of the summer, I was just kind of left asking myself, why do I care? Why do I care so much about, well, it seems like a heartless question to ask, but like, why do I care so much about empathy? And I came to this conclusion that if there's a chance that video games can inspire empathy in players, and that if empathy could lead at some point to some positive change in the world, then surely that's worth investigating. Oh, that, once again, wrong computer. Well, come on, Josh. Right, ... right. That's a really important right. Because I know I've played games that have emotionally rocked me to my core. I played Disco Elysium for the first time a couple of months ago. I finished that game and I stared into the empty void of space for about 2 hours because I was so emotionally numbed from just being so overwhelmed by one of the most brilliant stories and captivating characters I had ever played. So I know that there's some truth here. But before I can really assert this statement, we need to look into the research. We need to look into the science, and we need to ask ourselves if this is even possible for video games to do, or if something else is going on here. And that brings us to a research project, an undergraduate thesis, and this talk today, where we're going to answer a couple of questions. We're going to ask ourselves, what is empathy? Can video games build empathy in players, and what does that mean? Should we make empathy games? I'm going to pepper it with probably a really fast, because I'm going to yap for a long time, a really fast personal testimony, and we're going to hopefully end with some conclusions for both myself and for all of us in the room, how we can move forward and make games that connect more deeply with our audiences. So let's start with empathy and give ourselves a little bit of a crash course. By its most general definition, empathy is the reactions of one individual to the observed experiences of another. That general definition seems to be accepted in the realms of psychology and neuroscience. That is where consensus ends. It's where it begins and where it ends. Because as you can see, there's a billion possible theories, both from psychology and neuroscience, and even philosophy, to try and explain why empathy works the way it does and what is the underlying mechanism of it. But the metaphor that I guarantee you've all heard and said yourself and been shoved down your throats your entire life is that empathy is walking a mile in another person's shoes. Except if you've read ahead on the slides, you will realize that there is a whole cohort of research that says, in fact, empathy is not, in capital letters, not, a basic listening skill, compassion, sympathy, or putting oneself in another's shoes. How do we reconcile both of these things? The only way to really do it is to understand that empathy is multidimensional and say that it's not just putting oneself in another's shoes. And in fact, when we consider that and we have a look at this multidimensional model, this idea of perspective taking is where shoes come from, right? Putting on another person's shoes, taking the perspective of another person and their identity. So the next question to ask then is, can a story inspire empathy? And the research is actually fairly conclusive on this. It's yes. It's a big emphatic yes. And the way that they do that is through emotional transportation. The idea that we are totally engrossed in a story and that we are emotionally invested in character, plot, and world. Studies have shown a positive correlation between fiction consumption and increased empathy in readers. And readers reporting high emotional transportation were more likely to experience increased empathy, to perceive that of themselves. Interestingly enough, the reverse is also true. If you read a story and you experience low emotional transportation, you are less likely to experience an empathic reaction as a result. Now, if we look closely at this definition, any potential theory fans in the room we'll notice something about this convergent process where all mental systems and capacities become focused on events. This idea of narrowing down and forgetting everything else. What's the video game word for that? Immersion. A player needs to be immersed to be emotionally transported. And now we can kind of put psychology and neuroscience to the side and put on our narrative design hats with this gorgeous, beautiful man right here, Mihai Csikszentmihalyi. I'll give you a poster if you can correctly pronounce his name at the end of the session. I kind of view him as really such a pioneer of thinking about immersion in all facets of life in his seminal work, Flow. He says that flow, or the flow state, provides a sense of discovery, a creative feeling of transporting, nudge, nudge, wink, wink, the person into a new reality. It pushes the person to a higher level of performance and led to previously undreamed of states of consciousness. We're onto something here, right? Csikszentmihalyi is already kind of putting forward the idea that there's some kind of transportation that goes on, that I move into a new world, a new realm when I am immersed. Expanding on this work, another very beautiful person, Marie-Laure Ryan, who is a digital narratologist that I quite like to follow, she has this theory that immersions break down into different immersion types. That when different senses and different cognitive functions are engaged, that we become more immersed. And her big conclusion is that different mediums, by the nature of their construction, deliver on these immersions with varying success. And that brings us to this table. Now, when I show this table to people, I usually get a variety of reactions. So let me immediately just put a note out here. The quote from this paper, Ryan herself says, "This assignment of values describes general affordances rather than distinctive features. It does not prevent individual texts from challenging the limitations of their medium." Right? This is not necessarily a definition. This is not a strict hard and fast ceiling. This is more an observation of general patterns. Now, that being said, Marie, if you're watching this somehow, I love you. I love you. Need to remember, what the absolute hell is that? What is that? Come on, Marie, how could you do this to me? I know from my own experience, and maybe I've just played the special games that Ryan mentions. But I'm sorry. I need to fix this. I need to fix this. That's so much better. In conclusion, empathy is the reactions of one individual to the observed experiences of another, and it's more than just walking a mile in another person's shoes. Stories that inspire empathic responses do so by way of emotional transportation. Emotional transportation is best facilitated by immersion, putting players in flow states. So player is immersed, player is emotionally transported, player experiences empathetic response. That is the pipeline. If we believe Ryan / Stead-Dorval, because I just changed that table, if we believe us, there is only one row on that table that ranks high on everything. And what row is it, audience? It's video games. It's the reason that we're here. So we have to ask ourselves, are video games uniquely positioned to tell more empathic stories? And through the research, we have arrived at the question, can video games build empathy? And I'm going to answer it right now. It depends. Thank you so much, everybody, for coming to my talk. I really appreciate your time. Of course, there's more to the story than that. It depends on who you ask. The argument in favor, the research that found a positive correlation between playing video games and experiencing an empathic response suggests that games need to have a certain type of mechanics, narrative, and context in order for this to be maximized. Here is our golden table of ideal qualities. We're looking for either single-player or team-based cooperative multiplayer games. We're looking for games with pro-social content, any content that involves helping anything basically that isn't violent content, right? Helping other people, trying to improve society, et cetera, and something with a clear and engaging narrative. There's a couple of limitations to this, and most notably, I know I just mentioned pro-social content, but what perhaps it was a surprise to me, and what perhaps may be a surprise to us, is that violence alone may not discount empathy. There was actually patterns in the research that suggested violent games in the right context of play and the right context of narrative also featured an increase in empathy, specifically violence in this team-based cooperative multiplayer setting. Now, we can get into further questions about who is the empathy being experienced for and what extra dimension is kind of being added when we experience empathy for some and not for others. Is there other players? Is it the NPCs, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. But some of the limitations on this research is that a lot of these studies had a limited exposure to games. Players would sit down, they would play a game for 10 minutes, and then they would take a survey about how they feel about their own empathy responses. Which, for the sake of study, is like fine, but we're all gamers in this room, in addition to being writers and designers and developers and things like that. Almost none of us will sit down and play a game for 10 minutes unless it's like the New York Times games or something like that, right? So that's just interesting to think about. And there's also a question of longevity. How long is am I going to feel empathy as a result of a game a week from now? Am I going to feel it a year from now, 10 years from now? Is it going to stick with me for the rest of my life? That's still an open question in the field. Now, the argument against this foundation, the foundation of this argument, comes from the academic discourse on violent video games inspiring violent behavior, which I'm sure we're all familiar with either through research, playing games, or just watching this discourse unfold in the kind of the cultural zeitgeist. And the kind of grand conclusion of that, now that we have kind of moved on, shall we say, from the idea that, at least I hope, that violent video games inspire violent behavior, the flip side of that coin justifies this argument that if that's true, then pro-social games don't influence pro-social behavior. And to the credit of a lot of these studies, they do raise some interesting questions that our argument for studies really haven't quite addressed. Are empathetic people just more naturally drawn to pro-social play? A lot of these studies, almost by accident, found that certain predictors like social competence, anxiety, and depression, which I think is kind of funny, are linked to higher levels of empathy. So people who identify this way suffer, from these kinds of conditions, whatever predictors that may be. Do they experience empathy differently? Do they experience it more? Do they want to play pro-social games? Now, some more causes for question. A lot of this research has been accused of and defended with publication bias. So take that with a grain of salt. I actually found a couple of different papers that went back and forth over one meta-analytic study saying, yes, this does have publication bias. No, this doesn't have publication bias. Yes, this does have publication bias. And it extended over the course of like 7 years from study number 1 to study number 3. And there's also noticeably a lot more disagreement among scholars. Like they all come to this idea, but they don't come to it in the same way. Whereas there's, at least from my personal perspective, a lot more cohesion of ideas in the pro argument. So take that what you will. That probably shows you where my biases lie as a researcher and as a narrative designer. But all that being said and done, can video games build empathy? The answer remains, it depends on who is playing the game, how the game is played, who the game is played with, on the contents of the game, on the content of the game, and therefore housing all of those things is the game's narrative. And that narrative piece is so crucial and can make or break the different kinds of content and the different parameters. If there is a game that is like maximally, the maximal chance of producing empathy, it's this one. Team-based cooperative games, or single-player games with pro-social content and a clear, engaging narrative. And that now begs the question, do we call that an empathy game? Is that a title that we ascribe to games like this? Or are games like this built to seek that title? Which all kind of just goes to ask the question, how is any of this being implemented in the modern game development and design space? So let's talk about what the empathy game is. This is a definition that I wrote from seeing a lot of different definitions online. We're going to look at an alternate definition that I think is also very good in a second. But it's essentially, empathy games are games whose primary objective is to make the player empathize with a person or group of people represented in some way by the game itself. And you can read these quotes. These are 2 blog quotes that come from 10 years apart, 2013, 2023. Now, it's possible that these are not emblematic of the whole kind of picture of what people are thinking about empathy games. But I chose these 2 quotes for a reason. Notice anything in the highlighted text? Shoes, right? Here come that damn shoes metaphor. And yet we know that empathy is not, or not just, putting oneself in another's shoes. So what's going on here? Why are people using shoes to justify this idea of the empathy game? We can't doubt that there is very good, very positive intention here, wanting to use games to help contribute, exactly as I said, right? Wanting to use games to make a difference, wanting to help contribute to society. But something else is going on here, and we have to talk about it. Why do people want to make games like this? These are just 3 reasons. These are the major reasons I found. First, people want to make empathy games to teach. They want to use empathy games to have players learn something new. Second, they want to use empathy games as perspective simulators for ways of experiencing and understanding a complex struggle or natural facet of daily life from a different perspective, usually one based on ethnicity, gender, sexual orientation, religious identity, any kind of identifier that causes some kind of conflict or strife in the real world. And finally, empathy games as moral instructions. One of the studies that I'd actually already used and that was arguing for empathy games had this to say: research has also shown empathy levels have diminished as a result of lifestyle changes. Exploring ways to experience and teach empathic emotions are thus becoming increasingly important. Now, whatever you're feeling about that quote, like with the shoes thing at the beginning, hold on to it as we keep going and keep reflecting on how that makes you feel. Is there any, almost hit the wrong button again. Is there any precedent for empathy games working? Yeah, there is actually. This is just one example. This is My Life as a Refugee. It was developed by the UN High Commissioner for Refugees to, quote, raise awareness, sensitize people worldwide, and encourage informed discussions. This is an empathy game as a teacher, an empathy game as a perspective simulator. In it, you play the role of a refugee trying to escape their country and seek asylum somewhere else. And a study was done to collect the responses of players, and it was very successful, right? Then I always thought it was me in that moment, because it always said you, although it wasn't the other person, of course, but I actually somehow that in that moment that it was sort of me. If we're paying attention, that's our pipeline right there. They were immersed, they were emotionally transported, and they felt empathy. This is an example of the research suggesting that this works. But, huge but, there is more to the story here. And these are just a couple of the problems that come out of thinking about empathy almost in the way that we have been thinking about it. First, let's talk about games and morality. If empathy games want to serve as moral instructors, that weird third thing that might make us feel some interesting emotions, it's crucial to consider if video games even have that capability in the first place. To try and pull that off, we have to take into account a tremendous amount of philosophy. What does right mean? What does wrong mean? What influence does good and bad have in the world? Who is good? Who is bad? What impact does that have? These are all questions we have to think about. And to answer them, we are projecting a moral conception of the world into our game to purposefully instill it into our players. I would argue that that is not only a regressive presentation of ethical decision-making in our lived world. Those games, with all due respect, are so boring. They're so boring. I do an action, it's either good or bad. I don't decide if that's good or bad. The game decides if that's good or bad. And the whole exercise of the game is that I hope my morals agree with the game, and if not, the game forces my morals to be. Or I get the bad ending. And the hopes that we have even a sliver of time for Q&A at the end, I'm going to skip my tangent on Papers, Please, which is a phenomenal game. If you want to hear my tangent on Papers, Please, come find me after the talk, or I will type it out in the thread. But for now, to kind of keep ourselves on track, let's go back to the shoes metaphor. If empathy is not walking a mile in another person's shoes, and yet that's what empathy games are by their own admission doing, then what's the deals with the shoes? Were we given the shoes to walk in freely? Are we borrowing them to play the game? Or are we stealing them? I don't have a picture of them here, but I really want to highlight the work of Bo Ruberg. They're an incredible scholar and games designer specializing in queer games. And their work formed the basis of this part of the talk, and also caused me to question a lot of things that I think about games and how I make games. So huge thank you to them. Bo, in case you're watching, thank you so much. But in short, kind of two main things. Empathy games have the effect of commodifying the experience of the marginalized for the education and entertainment of the privileged through this concept of identity tourism, which allows players to appropriate any identity without any of the risks of being associated with a minority in real life. Because of this as a term, empathy then is ended up being used to group together, brush over, and in some cases just straight up erase more nuanced emotions relating to a minority experience, again, in service of appealing to the privileged. And speaking of audience, I want to also shout out an absolute icon and legend in the game space, Anna Anthropy. She is amazing. Go play her games. Go read her book. And the question is pretty simple. Who's the real audience of empathy games? Should games, especially made by marginalized creators, be designed to edify the privileged about the experience of the marginalized? In Anthropy's words, if you've played a 10-minute game about being a trans woman, don't pat yourself on the back for feeling like you understand a marginalized experience. Kind of a no-brainer when you think about it, right? And yet, this is exactly the logic that I found myself falling into when I wanted to help make an empathy game, right? I wanted to give that 10-minute experience to a privileged audience to help them understand. When in fact, I should have been asking not only who should be writing this experience, but who should be experiencing this experience. So how do we move forward? If I've just kind of stood here and blown up the concept of empathy games, how do we still try and make games that engender an empathic response? Because theoretically, none of the research has anything to do. This has all been in how it's been applied in politics of effect and the political discourse, and just in the design. Well, the way that Bo Ruberg suggests and that I'm going to suggest to you today is that we rethink empathy. That we need a vision of empathy that is not about appropriating or instrumentalizing the feelings of others, but instead that values games that challenge the straightforwardness of interpersonal connection. And that brings us back to this picture and this game, Peaceland, Choose Your Memory. And this is where I'm going to jump into like 3 minutes of personal testimony, because I want to talk about 3 conceptions I had coming into this game that ended up being both troublesome for the writing experience and also played into this idea of identity tourism and stealing someone else's shoes. The first thing I should explain, the main mechanic of the game is you as a player playing a character in the present are going and exploring memories of the past. You, the player, jump into those memories and play through them, come back, inhabit the main character, and then make decisions as a result, right? First conception is that we wanted to present as little to no information about a character's identity before the player plays them, so they can empathize with them as a person, not based on identifying communities or anything like that, to try and work against either biases made while playing the rest of the game or any implicit biases coming into the game. The obvious problem is that people didn't know who the hell they were playing when they were playing the game. So our fix there for that was pretty easy. Just let people know who you're playing and trust that your audience, and we'll get to audience in a second, is going to be able to connect with these people in the way that they're going to connect with them. And also at the end of the day, what would help is to develop a deeper sense of character, right? If for some reason you are going to try to make this work, you need a really, really, really deep sense of character. And you also need to be a really good writer, because writing this was so difficult. It was really, really freaking hard. And we kind of did it and we kind of didn't. So that's my advice. Second thing, on the concept of morality, I wanted to categorize individual actions and dialogue choices as good or bad, with their amalgamation contributing to a good ending, a medium ending, and a bad ending. This goes against everything that I just stood here and preached about games and morality systems, and kind of making a boring, unrealistic, unfaithful game. There is no gray in a world like a post-conflict environment that is full of gray. I mean, it's almost all gray, right? Not in color, in moral, you get it. So the reworked idea is to instead motivate decisions and the consequences of decisions with character, plot, and world. Just go back to being a writer, right? And thinking about things not in terms of good and bad, right and wrong, but separating that concept and making grounded decisions by working with our collaborators in Kosovo and the Balkans to determine what the real responses of the real people in these kinds of situations would be, and use that to inform the progression of the story and not this binary concept of good and bad. And finally, and perhaps most kind of importantly to me, my intention as I went into this game was I thought that we were going to make it and give it back as a artifact and an exercise and a tool for peace building to peace building organizations in post-conflict environments, and release it to the general public, for the exact reason that Bo Ruberg and Anthropy warned us against, to use that identity tourism to try and edify a privileged general audience. And the way to rethink that is to rethink who your audience is and who you're designing for, and to not only continue to persist that collaboration with that core audience, but also to increase it. Let those stories come from them. Let them lead in the development process and really put their mark on the game, because that's the mark that really matters. So in the 30 seconds I have left, how do we move forward with this? Well, I have 5 tips for us. First of all, if you're making a game that might be an empathy game, question why you're making it. If you're making it because you want the players to experience an empathic result, if that is goal number 1, don't make your game. Come up with a better reason to make your game and ditch that, right? Let that be a byproduct of the collaboration and the creative process. Number 2, consider pro-social play. If the research has told us anything, consider game mechanics, narrative beats, and things like that that don't necessarily rely on violence. But remember that violence is not an immediate discounter if used in the right context. 3, build immersion always. Without immersion, there is no empathy. So if you want to connect with your audiences, you have to think about immersion. And speaking of connected with audiences, putting your player experience first is so important. Swery, so in his keynote, so emphasized that, right? He made decisions about who his main character was and what the arc of the story was by asking himself and his team, what does he want the player to feel? And notice that not a single one of those words was the word empathy. They were all grounded emotions that resulted from interpersonal relationships. And finally, and perhaps kind of sappy, but create together. No game that attempts to do it, that attempts to connect with people, is made in a vacuum. And the only way we have any hope of connecting with our audiences is by creating our games together. And I suppose I do have one more piece of advice. I don't need to borrow your shoes anymore. I'm going to leave that idea in the past, and I think you should as well. Thank you so much for being here. Thank you. We are approximately out of time for a Q&A, but I'm going to be around and I'm going to be looking at the thread. Thank you to everybody on Discord. And I suppose to reward anybody who wants to hear my papers, please rant. It's a good rant, I promise. It's more of a ramble. I'm going to have some of these NarraScope. I've been told I can give these out for good questions. So I'm going to have some of these. And if you come listen to my rambling thoughts on Papers, Please, you'll get a poster. So thank you so much, everyone. Have a great rest of your NarraScope, and I look forward to chatting with you soon. Thank you.